Hey there, welcome. Today we're going to learn how to properly expose Sony Log 3. Let's get started. Today we will learn about Sony Log 3 in 3 different ways: settings, monitoring, and processing. Before we begin, it's important to understand what log actually is. Log is defined as a shooting profile with an in-camera gamma curve that gives a wide dynamic range and tonal curve, allowing for more latitude to provide more creative color and style choices. Cameras can retain more highlights and shadow detail while shooting in log. Now, there are 3 different types of exposure profiles: Rec. 709, log, and raw. As you can see, every camera company has their own variation of these 3 different exposure profiles. However, today we are just going to focus on log, specifically Sony Log 3. Now, there are 3 different variations of Sony Log. We have Sony Log 2, and Sony Log 3. The differences between all log profiles are generally found within the gradation of colors as well as the dynamic range. Now, depending on which camera you are using, you may get more dynamic range with Sony Log 1, 2, or 3 if you are using higher end cinema cameras. However, for most of you using the Sony FX3, the Sony FX30, or even the A7 series, you are limited to using Sony Log 3. And that's who we're making this video for. Let's break down the Sony Log 3 workflow. Stage 1 is settings. Stage 2 is monitoring. And stage 3 is processing. In stage 1, we're going to be focusing on our camera settings, selecting the right gamut, selecting log mode, and confirming that we are shooting at the natural base ISO, which is 800 and 12,800. However, more on that later. When it comes to monitoring, we will discuss our zebras, our display LUT, and our histograms. And in stage 3, we'll discuss how to convert, correct, and color grade, each stage working collectively together to reach the perfect image. Let's begin with camera settings. I highly suggest pausing the video, taking a screenshot of the image that you see on the screen right now, and then store this in your phone so that you can remember all of the perfect camera settings that you should be using to get the perfect image with Sony Log 3 out of your Sony camera. Regarding frame rate and white balance, these 2 settings will change based upon the shooting environment that you are in and whether or not you want to shoot in slow motion or in natural motion. For anyone using the Sony FX series, your base ISO will be 800. The second base ISO will change depending on whether or not you're using a full frame or micro 4/3 sensor. You should be using the log shooting mode of Cine EI. This stands for exposure index. Your color gamut should be Sony Log 3. Be sure to double your shutter speed and use the proper white balance when shooting. By using these in-camera settings, you're preparing yourself to capture a more perfect image. Now we just have to confirm we're monitoring exposure properly and then converting our image correctly. If you do get confused by all of the Sony users who are arguing and cannot agree on the base ISO for your camera, well, here's a pro tip. If you're not at the proper ISO for your camera, there is going to be a little line indicator around your ISO that shows up to indicate you are not at the base ISO. When that line disappears, that means you are at the proper base ISO. So if you don't want to trust anyone else and you want to be confident that you are at the proper ISO, look at your ISO, see if there's a little flashing line by it, and if there is, you are at the wrong ISO, and just keep bumping it up or down until that line disappears, and that will indicate you are at your true base ISO. Now let's talk about the most controversial topic in the Sony world: how to expose for Sony Log 3. You may find out that most Sony users cannot agree on the proper way to expose Sony Log 3. And that's why I'm here to provide you with a reference image. Take a screenshot of this image, test it out yourself to determine which way you prefer to expose. Based upon the image that you're seeing now, it's good practice to expose in the middle or expose to the right. I don't recommend underexposing, although some people do. And I definitely do not recommend overexposing. If you're curious about how I expose, well, I expose in the middle, and that's because I want to spend less time in post-production and more time with my wife and my son. When you become a dad, that changes the way you think about the world and the way you spend your time. So it's good practice to expose in the middle if you want less work to do in post-production. If you want to expose to the right, well then expose to the right, but you will spend more time recovering that detail in post-production. If you had to choose between exposing in the middle and exposing to the right, and maybe even underexposing if you're one of those people, the way I would determine which option to choose is by discerning which option that will support the amount of time that you can invest into converting, correcting, and color grading your image. I will continue to expose in the middle, although for a lot of my career, I exposed to the right. Now, here's a pro tip. Unless you are using a high-end cinema camera, and in this case, you're probably using the Sony FX3, maybe the FX6. Unless you are using a high-end cinema camera, I would strongly suggest getting the image correct directly in camera. Now, let's move on and talk about how to expose and monitor Sony Log 3. Now, this will change depending on which camera you are using, the FX series or the A7 series. With the Sony FX series, you do have the ability to monitor exposure with zebras, your histogram, as well as a display LUT. All of these can help you monitor exposure that will allow you to get a more perfect looking image. So let's talk about histograms. What is a histogram in the first place? A histogram is a graph of the tonal values of an image from black on the left to white on the right. The height of the graph indicates the amount of pixels within that specific tonal range. Higher levels equals more pixels. Now, histograms can be very confusing to read, especially when they're on the back of that tiny little camera screen. So here is an image to help you understand the way histograms work. The more you understand the way a histogram works, the better you can monitor exposure on your Sony camera. It's safe to say just keep the information in the middle. If you do this, you will end up with an image that is exposed in the middle or even slightly to the right. If you end up in any of these two exposure ranges, you've captured a safe image. Here's an example of what an underexposed image looks like, a properly exposed image, and then an image that is overexposed. Notice when an image is over or underexposed, you will see a spike, which creates a straight line on your histogram. This is the most evident way of understanding that you have overexposed an image. And if you see this very, very sharp line, back it down a little bit to preserve your highlights. You can always bring back shadows, but you can never bring back highlights. Let's talk about zebras. What the heck is a zebra? We're not talking about the animal here. The zebra pattern will indicate that you are close to being overexposed. The zebra patterns will appear on the parts of an image if brightness levels exceed the IRE that you set in camera. Here are a couple examples of how zebras show up on different cameras. Notice the parts of the image that are under or overexposed are overlaid with a zebra pattern. This means that the image is either close to being over or underexposed, and you need to back it down a little bit. This is another controversial topic. The zebra levels will change depending on whether or not you are using a display LUT or not. Based upon Sony's recommendations, with the display LUT off, your highlights should sit at 61%, and your skin tones should sit at 52%. Now, when you turn the display LUT on, you will notice that your zebras disappear, and that's because your monitor is judging exposure based upon the display LUT you are using. If you are using different display LUTs, your zebra patterns will be very different. I personally use my own custom LUTs, which we'll talk about in a second. This means the zebra levels that I recommend are based on using my own personal LUTs. The zebra levels I recommend are 47% for the highlights and then 45% for the skin tones. Now you can see a dramatic difference in Sony's recommendations versus what I recommend. And that's because we have the display LUT on, and I've designed these LUTs to preserve highlights. Now, let's talk about display LUTs. What is a display LUT? Rather than viewing a flat, desaturated image on the back of your camera screen, a display LUT will map your image to a specific color space. A display LUT will allow you to view your image in real time with saturation and contrast so that you can see what your image may look like in post-production. Here's a reference of what a log and display LUT looks like in comparison. Would you rather look at the flat image on the back of your screen or the graded version? Now, let's talk about the LUTs that I've designed. I've been designing my own LUTs to solve a real problem over the last year and a half, testing relentlessly to make sure that I dial in the gradation between the colors, that I preserve my highlights and my skin tones, that I can clean up the shadows of an image so I don't have to worry about that in post-production, and that these LUTs can be used to monitor and color grade all at the same time. When you become a dad, you look for any possible way to create a solution so that you can have more time with your family. And these LUTs are the byproduct of that. Now, if you are interested in these LUTs, you will receive 50% off by using the discount code Genesis. Click the link in the description to be redirected to the page where you can purchase these LUTs, and then upon checkout, use the discount code Genesis to receive 50% off. And thank you to all of the filmmakers who've been testing these LUTs behind the scenes over the last year to ensure that I'm creating high quality premium LUTs that get the job done without damaging your footage. Now, let's talk about processing. Now, when it comes to processing, there are multiple NLEs that you can use to process your footage. You can use Final Cut Pro, DaVinci Resolve, or Premiere. I personally use DaVinci Resolve and Final Cut Pro every now and then. I don't use Premiere, and I don't necessarily recommend it. However, it is very popular for many reasons. With any of these NLE softwares, you can correct and convert and color grade your image as long as you follow best practices. The proper way to process your Sony Log 3 footage goes like this. You start by converting your image. In DaVinci Resolve, you will convert your image using a CST, which is a color space transform, a LUT, which is what I've created and what I use the most, or the traditional way of adding your own contrast and color. Follow this as step 1 in your processing stage in any NLE, and this will result in a converted image. Next, we will move to stage 2 of the processing phase, which is correction. You might not nail your exposure or your white balance in camera, and that's okay, because you can fix it in post-production. Start with exposure, adjust your shadows, then your highlights, and then your midtones. Do it in that order to get perfect exposure. Next, you will dial in your contrast. Once you've dialed in your contrast, the final thing to correct is white balance. You can do an auto white balance, or you can just move your primaries or your color wheels to remove the color you want or add the color you need. Finally, we move into stage 3 of the processing phase, which is color grading. Start by adding color into the shadows that you want, and then into the highlights, and then into the midtones. Now, if you don't want to spend a lot of time color grading, or you just don't know how and you're not confident about it yet, this is where my LUTs come in. When you download and apply my custom LUTs, you can convert and color grade your Sony Log 3 footage, and all you will have to do is correct if you don't nail your exposure or your white balance. There you have it. You now know how to properly expose Sony Log 3. However, if you are still struggling to find clients, none of this really matters unless you're a hobby videographer, and that's perfectly fine. But if you are interested in finding more clients, and if you're not making at least $20,000 each month as a videographer, I highly suggest checking out Videography Business Mastery. Videography Business Mastery is unique and unlike any other film school on the market right now. And that's because nobody else is teaching you how to start, scale, and then sell your video production company so that you can exit with $1, maybe even $2 million, and then continue your passion somewhere else, or just kick back and retire if that's something you're into. You actually have the opportunity to join a community of other like-minded filmmakers from all around the world who are all pursuing the same thing: to start, scale, and then sell their video production company. But if you can make the money quick and have fun doing it, it's a win-win. Here's a list of some of the things that we do in Videography Business Mastery. One-on-one mentorships. You'll be working with me directly from starting, scaling, and then selling your video production company. You'll gain community access to filmmakers from all around the world. Of course, you'll have access to online mastery courses, which you will not be able to find anywhere else. If you are part of Videography Business Mastery, you do get access to free LUTs and assets, which means if you're interested in the display LUT we talked about in this video, you would get it for free inside of Videography Business Mastery. We do gear giveaways, discounts on software that you will need to run your company, in-person workshops in all parts of the world, job opportunity referrals for people who have a client that's not a good fit and they just want to share it with you, job shadowing opportunities in case you want to step on set of a real life production, and then weekly group training done online. If you are interested in joining our community, of course, you probably know there's a link in the description for that as well. Let's summarize. Today we learned 3 lessons. Lesson 1, how to expose Sony Log 3. Lesson 2, how to monitor Sony Log 3. Lesson 3, how to process Sony Log 3. If you made it this far, congratulations. You've just completed this lesson on how to expose Sony Log 3. Thank you so much for watching. If there is something that we didn't cover in this video and you still have further questions, leave a comment down below to have your questions answered. I'll see you in the next one.